Okay, so now we're going to talk about operant conditioning. And so operant conditioning involves the reinforcement of behavior, and this behavior is not automatic. It's a behavior or response that is done voluntarily, whereas classical conditioning is about the association between a neutral stimulus and a biologically significant stimulus. Now, we can say that operant conditioning is more like the association between a biologically significant stimulus and a response through reinforcement. And here's one example of a contraption of something that you might find in an operant conditioning experiment. On the left, you see what's called a cumulative recorder, and then there's this roll of paper that gets unraveled at a constant rate, and then there's this marker that's attached to the lever that the rat presses. And what happens is, if the rat presses this lever, then the marker will take note of that. And so you can see that the slope of this line is to indicate, well, it indicates how much the rat pressed the lever. And you can also look at whether well, anyways, yeah. And so the point here is that you look at the lever pressing as a function of time. So if this line were more steep, then you would say that the rat learned the association between the reinforcer and the response at a faster rate rather than a slower rate, or rather than a shallower line, right? So a shallower line means that there wasn't as much learning, whereas if it's steep, then that means there was a lot of learning. So the point here that I mainly just want to make is that the response of the lever pressing increases because the behavior of lever pressing was reinforced, usually by some sort of pellet or food. So here's this sort of two by two table, I think, that helps organize the different kinds of operant conditioning as well as the names associated with them. So the first thing you should ask yourself is whether the unconditioned stimulus is a good unconditioned stimulus or is it a bad unconditioned stimulus. What that means, what I mean is the unconditioned stimulus is it something that you like? Is it something that creates some amount of pleasure? Or is it a bad unconditioned stimulus? Is it something that's painful or uncomfortable in some way? So examples of unconditioned stimulus would include food, sex, drugs. Those would be considered good unconditioned stimuli. Of course, drugs are bad, but they do feel good, which is why they're addictive. So in this case, in this sense, drugs would be a good unconditioned stimulus, whereas a bad unconditioned stimulus would be something like electric shock, right? Anything that's painful or produces some amount of discomfort. So the next question you would ask yourself is, does the behavior in question that we're talking about, right? Does it produce the unconditioned stimulus or does it prevent the unconditioned stimulus? So for example, if the behavior in question prevents a bad unconditioned stimulus, right? We would call this avoidance escape. And some people call it negative reinforcement, right? So in this example, an example I could think of is imagine if you were a prisoner of war and you're being tortured in order to get information. So they're torturing you. That's a bad unconditioned stimulus because it's very painful. But if you give up information, right, about your side, then it will prevent that unconditioned stimulus. So the torture will stop. And the consequence of this training, of this kind of training, is that it increases that kind of behavior. So that's why there's a blue arrow going up here. Um, yeah, it increases that kind of behavior. So that's the blue line. And that's supposed to indicate that when the behavior in question prevents a bad unconditioned stimulus from being presented, what ends up happening is that the behavior increases more. Another one we can talk about is omission training. And this is when a type of behavior prevents a good unconditioned stimulus, right, from happening. So, for example, if you're doing some sort of juvenile delinquent behaviors, if you're doing something that you're not supposed to do, well, if your parents find out, they might take away your phone. And your phone, right, is a good unconditioned stimulus, right? Um, and so that will have the effect of reducing your delinquent behaviors. And some people also call this negative punishment. And so you can think of negative as taking away something, right? So both of these are about taking away the unconditioned stimulus, whereas there are positive types of training where that produces the unconditioned stimulus. And so if it's a bad unconditioned stimulus, so now we're in this cell, so there's some behavior that produces a bad unconditioned stimulus, uh, that would be called punishment, right? And so, for example, if your parents hit you, if you do something bad, then that would be punishment. It's also called positive punishment, but it's punishment nevertheless. And this would lead to a decrease in delinquent behavior, is the idea. And then probably the most intuitive type of training, which we're going to focus on for the most of this lecture, is that a certain kind of behavior produces a good unconditioned stimulus, and that has the effect of increasing whatever behavior it is that produced that unconditioned stimulus. And so, this is called reward training, but it's also called positive reinforcement. And so, for a lot of the talk, we'll be mainly focusing on positive reinforcement. Okay. And then we'll talk about Tolman's cognitive maps in the next lecture.